Okay, let the jam session begin. We're looking
Yeah.
for points of concordance, and maybe Jason wants to get us started off with the richness that he senses under Weinstein's idea of all true narratives converging.
Okay. I will circle back to what I just talked about before we were recording. So you and I did a chat a month or two ago when that was posted in the liminal Facebook page. Jill was one of the only people who'd responded to that. And I had already gone through her conversation with you and noticed a number of different points of concordance, more at a structural level in terms of trying to break down and understand some of these things. And I'd reached out and say, hey, can we get a jam session going? Because I figured there was enough material there to kind of talk about. And I think there's definitely some differences in perspective, but I think there's a lot of viewpoint convergence at the structural level. And I think that's kind of where it fits into the all true narratives reconcile and trying to figure out where some of these broader ideas are starting to converge into something more coherent, and we can start to lay out a broader architecture in this kind of space in terms of exploration.
Yeah, if I can respond to that. I also sense that watching your podcast that, how can I speak to what's there? And I think you spoke to that really well by saying it's something structural. And my intuition was that it's kind of our own lived experience, this kind of systems we've been exposed to, the ways of thinking, the abstractions have kind of led us to a way of kind of breaking things down that might be, I don't know, that's recognized as maybe not underrepresented, maybe there's parts that are underrepresented. That we feel are underrepresented in the way people approach some of these things that maybe we can bring out. But there's some languaging, barriers, and maybe we're talking about the same thing with different words, or we're talking about, I sense a deeper resonance, and I'm not sure if we're going to be able what the span is going to be to get there underneath maybe layers of trying to make sure we're using the right words to point at the same things.
I
But the
like
Gestalt
that notion of the
resonates.
underemphasized elements, because I think all of us have an appreciation for developmental schools. I think all of us are interested in the structural software correlations to cognitive development. And I think we're all aware that a lot of the ways people are talking about the things that we find to be most interesting are insufficient in some way, that they're either not leaning into things that are problematic, associated with ambiguity and negative affect, or they're not being personal enough, or they're not adding certain dimensions of richness to it that we think need to be added, and they're not seeing as much of the overall shared patterning between these domains as we would need to see in order to actually have some kind of integrated, useful super picture.
Yeah, and I think that might be what Jason, is it safe to say that's what you're pointing out with the idea of boundary conditions is maybe one thing that's that there are things you can pull out as being kind of intrinsic to the system that aren't being pointed out, like that are if you don't address the boundary conditions, you don't really know what system you're talking about.
Back to the language thing. I think if we can reconcile some of our language, then we can go through this the framing of the information psychotechnologies as information technologies. And if we can figure out the linguistic bridging, then we can start to develop those tacit knowledge pointers that actually become kind of archived in the building blocks for later work.
Yeah.
So right here, are there places where we suspect there are languaging dissonances that need to be clarified?
Yeah, I mean, we did start out with my not wanting to concede the point until I understood more that psychotechnologies, information technologies, because I pointed out in our thread that the word information is so problematic to me, and the concept of information so problematic, and the concept of representation, software, mind as computer, that we contain data, information, knowledge, knowing, all that kind of thing is, we'd have to kind of make sure we're talking about, even agreeing what we mean by the word information seems like almost as hairy as saying what is consciousness. Like you could, you kind of open up a big can of worms there. So I'd love to hear kind of Jason's how I've only heard that phrase. I have not heard him fill in kind of what's underneath it. Maybe that would be a good place.
Yeah, that would be great. What do you mean
Yeah.
by information and information technology, Jason?
Principally software, as Jill was talking about before. I mean, that's the major, or the principal lens that I'm looking at it through. Backgrounding to that, I think if we're looking at the default mode network and we're looking at baseline state of being, off the factory floor, you have whatever temperaments kind of wired into you and whatever modifications the environment has made along the way. In order to move past that, I think you need to treat the default mode network like it's an artificial intelligence, and you're going through the same type of training mechanisms where you're giving it data, trying to figure out where boundary and contention points are, and constantly training and training instead of just keep on running that at the default mode. So if there's no secondary layer of metacognition affecting the default mode network, then it just basically continues to run at factory state. And what we want to do is take it from factory state and make it much more robust, not just anchored in whatever the baseline temperament is, but to give it a much broader range of experience and comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking at that in the context of software development. Like, it's really easy to write software that'll handle like 100 users or 1,000 users. When you get to 10,000, then you start running into some constraints. When you get into 100,000 users, you've got more constraints. It has to be much more efficient. And when you get to like 1 million plus users, it has to be very efficient. You have to do performance tuning, otherwise that system kind of crashes. And I'm kind of looking at that same metaphorical journey within cognition itself, and trying to use that as like an analog or a mapping to at least give us like the kind of language pointers of how to dig into that and address it. So really it's about developing much more robust models. So you're moving from that line area of volume abstraction, calibrated abstraction, and working within that space. And when we get to calibrated abstraction, we kind of have to remember that we just can't keep tacking levels of abstraction up on top of each other. That cantilever only goes so far. It has to be rooted back to something concrete, or it just kind of goes off the end of the wind. So kind of the developmental arc, and plus maintaining a balance at that higher level of abstraction so it doesn't become decoupled from reality. I think one of the issues I've seen with a lot of the conversations is there's just a lot of blue skying going on, and
Mm-hmm.
there's enough material on the table to start making some practical and tangible approaches going forward on some of this stuff, and trying to consolidate the coherent pieces from different perspectives and seeing how they're like the elephant in the room thing that both Jill and I have used that metaphor, where we're looking at some kind of subject and we're trying to accumulate all of those different perspectives into some kind of a coherent model.
Mm-hmm.
Does that clarify things a bit? Or any questions or pushback?
I think it does clarify things, and it was a kind of a broad swath and with multiple layers. I'm not sure if I'm clear on the layers of abstraction argument yet, so maybe I'll shelf that when we come back to that. But I wanted to throw out kind of like there are some distinctions that have been helpful to me that I've wrestled with too, and I think everyone's wrestling with right now with the 4E cog sci, which is that this idea of if we use an analogy of artificial neural nets with our brains, and I've kind of made this argument as well, that's a certain kind of architecture that I don't think it breaks down, and I don't think I think it's effectively like kind of falsified, as it doesn't really work as what we're doing in our right minds, but it might be a really good model of what we're doing, in a confabulatory free associated mind, a statistical, a causal mind, for a variety of reasons. But let me just say that, let me just throw out the metaphor that I've been using to kind of try to test my thinking, is that I've heard Philip Groff also start to point in his latest podcast, I think on Mind Chat with Papineau. I can't remember his first name right now, David Papineau. I thought they had a nice handling of this, but the idea that there is something that is in relation to the environment that is cognitive, and I tend to think of it almost like a good analogy is like an instrument, like you have an internal guitar, and or a piano, and you're constantly tuning, and that constantly is being tuned to be able to play along with reality. And so reality plays your piano, and then you have another process that can also play your piano. You can internalize an internal conceptual piano player, that there really is a piano in there that's being tuned and is empty, has no songs. So without that, I think it gets a little confusing that there is software does not have, AI does not have that. It does not have the piano. It doesn't have the thing that interacts with reality to be played and harmonize and be in relation to the environment. And that's what I'm kind of pointing at, is like the grounding, or what ultimately terminates into anything that would be reality based has to eventually get to the piano. And so software systems, as currently built, don't have that. There are creatures, that are being built in AI labs that are trying to build a piano, are building, kind of have that emerge in software. But that's not what I think what most people are pointing at when they think about that's not artificial neural nets in the current form, in the big data sense. So I'm not a proponent of the Bayesian brain being at the root level. So we can talk about that later, but I think that negates the Bayesian brain, and it also handles a lot of the scaling problems and the explosion and the layers of abstraction problem. So that's kind of an architectural starting point I try to bring to my thought experiments. So if I said, okay, so now what is a psychotechnology? How would I map the psychotechnology's information technology onto that metaphor? I would say that, you need various players to play your piano. If you want it tuned different ways, you can choose. You could say, like, the piano's only been played in this one way and only plays Mary Had a Little Lamb over and over again. It's driving me mad. I've got to get out there more, or I want to be able to play something more beautiful. I want to, I don't want this. This is not what the songs I want in my head. So I'm going to go expose myself to other songs and might need to do other tunings to play those songs. And that, so there's that experiential component. And in that way, the, information is the player, whether it be the environment or the person. So in that sense, I guess, like, I consider all of life as psychotechnology, but then what we actually point at and extract out are maybe things that we think are instrumental towards ends we desire for whatever, for whatever reason. And then I think there's another layer, a few more layers of psychotechnology towards harm, towards good, towards what ends, but we can just say in general, people do get in there and mess with their psyches, with technology.
So with the AI thing, I think I'm less trying to make a structural comparison or analogy between them, and more looking at the way we train AI. And when we go from the default mode network into, an integration with the executive network and kind of a whole embodied being, like, I like your phrase that cognition is embedded within the entire being, or you said something to paraphrase that. Mm-hmm. I think what we're trying to do with consciousness at kind of this, or what some of us are trying to do with consciousness at the social level, is take it from default mode network, factory state setting of temperament, which is an AI model, and bring our entire embodied being into AGI, or generalized intelligence. Mm-hmm. And I think the left brain really represents that AI model, where it's really quite limited. It's got a limited set of habits and algorithms that it can work with, but we need to kind of expand that through learning processes as we go on. So I hope that maybe clarifies that layout and structure a little better.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think that this is maybe working a little bit closer to the way to emphasize what we're trying to speak to, which is that might be a lot of resonance I feel in each other speaking, is that there are algorithmic or informational differences in what we'd consider left hemisphere, right hemisphere, that can be made quite explicit. And Judea Pearl and Ian McGilchrist both, kind of point a lot of the same things. So for, say, left hemisphere, we have, parts to whole, causal relationships, static, representations, not dynamic, and confabulatory. And then if we were to look at, I've often tried to just make the move to make people aware of, I feel like I could say this a million times a day, and I still wouldn't even touch in my conversations, I still wouldn't even touch how many times you'll need to hear this, that if you find yourself trying to think with static representations, like a person is this, or, a static assignment that doesn't consider the boundary conditions and context, a normative, assuming there's so few things that are actually normative where you'd say that you can generalize outside of the context, right? But like assume something's normative, all these things, assume that statistical interpretations are valid. Causal, assuming that things break down into cause and effect, which are dyadic relations and often only singular, at the next level, just even singular, they're almost like layers of like, what's wrong, first static's wrong, first normative's wrong, all these assumptions that go into left hemisphere thinking. Then you have the dyadic relation, and then if that weren't bad enough, often a singular cause and effect, often just to be disabused that there's multiple causes and effects would be like start to break you out of seeing the limitations, because often the left hemisphere is serial narrative, which is you can only, do so many causes in a sentence, or kind of linguistically structured and flatten these narratives, and the speech of the left hemisphere flattens like that. And then kind of the big gorilla in the corner of the room, elephant, gorilla, I always forget which one's in the corner of the room. We say whale. The whale in the corner of the room is polyadic, which is basically that, when you bring together different interactive systems, the nature of bringing them together changes all the interactions. The interactions are dependent on who else is participating in the interaction. So I have like a thought experiment of like, what's it like to be around your mother, at birth, like at your wedding, on a first date, like there's no one way it's like to be around your mother. But if you were to do a series of thought experiments, you might be able to tease something else out, but you see how deeply polyadic the relation of how everyone's interacting with you is dependent on who the players are, and that life is like that. And so I think that this is when we're talking about maybe what's worth pointing at and developmental models. Like if anyone's been following me on the, some of the Limo Web discussions, I appear to be extremely anti-developmental models and stage models. And I think that's also worth pointing out, is I'm very against the overgeneralization of models, but within context, there's definitely, to say there's no progression of anything within context would be absurd. I think Nora Bateson says the same thing. That'd be absurd to claim that. That's not what's being claimed. What's being claimed is that they're overstepping bounds constantly by trying to say that this is like a spiritual developmental stage, or an emotional developmental stage, or an intellectual developmental stage. Like you've got to say a lot more before you can generalize like that. You can say you definitely learned a lot about how to think about physics and this, and how to work with a certain set of abstractions. To say that, you've developed something else, you have to back that up much stronger than just calling it a stage. So with all those disclaimers, I would say that I do think that there is something about a certain level of working with systems and introspection and noticing that would have someone start to believe more that many things are polyadic that they thought before were dyadic, and many things are multiple relational causal that they thought before were simple causal. Many things are not so generalizable that they thought were generalizable. And I think that I'll make this last point and then I'll stop, because I'm kind of now tangenting a little bit too far. But I also think something that's worth pointing out a lot is that in the metamodern scene, when you try to bring up these kind of nuances, for me, it's been interpreted as being postmodern, like, oh, nothing's meaningful, everything's subjective, there's no truth. Instead of saying, no, just the opposite. Like, the best science, the most things we know with most certainty, the physics everyone emulates of like, that's rock solid stuff, is bringing in all the context. It always does. It says, this is true in this context and only in this context. And, and these are the boundary conditions, and these are the, starting assumptions, and, math does it. And so it's saying that the next move to me is to restore that. So we stop overgeneralizing, which to me is like pre-modern, modern, and then the critique of postmodern. It's not a free-for-all that makes you metamodern. To me, it's this one move of weirdly getting more contextual, understanding that meta of to get more contextual is to move towards a truer knowing, direct knowing that is not the same as saying everyone's truth is equally valid and there are no experts, and that whole critique. I'm not sure how that landed, but that's
I would say two things. I think one is that if people lack the background to follow what you're saying, then they don't follow it to the point of seeing the structures you're describing. They only see the opening
Right.
up move, right? And that's true whether we're talking about software or we're talking about ritual or whatever it is. If they don't really have a clear idea of what you're pointing to based on their own experience, then all they're going to hear is you're disagreeing with the structures they're trying to put forward. It sounds very postmodern and very vague to them.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is what interests me a lot in all of this are the interfaces, like whether it's the interface between left and right, or it's the interface between the sort of meta intelligence and the default mode network. And what is it what characterizes those interfaces when they're working in a way that would be actually moving us forward in some kind of rich sequence that we don't want to overgeneralize. And is it, Jill, we've talked about this quite a bit, like to what degree is like discrepancy detection and leaning into uncertainties? Like what's the most useful general way to orient our information processing in order to encourage the upgrade of the default mode network or the increased partnership of left and right?
Is that a so
That's
do you want me to
that's just where my
that?
answer goes. Anybody
Right.
can say anything they want.
Yeah, I mean, I have kind of a somewhat pat answer to that, which is to yeah, I'll give my generic spiel for anyone listening who hasn't heard it. My elevator pitch on how to handle the problem of which is to say that we haven't really talked about default mode networks. So I'm assuming that's a proxy for these background parasitic processes, trapped attention system, the program you didn't want, which is what I heard Jason speak to. Is what I've said is like thinking when you don't want to be thinking, like I don't want this in me, and just being bothered by that, or being bothered by the results of that. But in one way or another, that's the problem we're trying to address. And the way the process that I am aware of and I think is the best contender, but I'm always open to better suggestions, is to try to get in there and wrestle with the thing, break it down, struggle with the fog and the fuzzy any way you can to get catch anything by the tail that is part of the process. Like what is this about? What's going on there? Like you see if you can get any handle on it, right? But what's part of this structure? What is it? And then once you've articulated it, you're outside it, your attention's outside it, and you've got kind of caught the tiger by the tail. And then meditative inquiry, basically to take that thing and start to do attentional technologies on it or any piece of it to break up. The hypothesis is that all of these processes are, like Jason said, they're trained stupidly like an AI. They're kind of like, they were taken in without examination. They're likely taken in without examination because life is threatening in real time, and we have to take in these heuristics and shortcuts, and there's no time to catch up, kind of with that. So so there's a special role for attention technologies to break up, digest, metabolize, and process the backlog of default mode network processing. I'll stop there and
Sure. Yeah, I want to go to Jason here, but
Yeah.
I think what I'm hearing a lot of is the need to, in a grounded way, clarify what the process of development is in any context, to the point where we can then encode that as internal practice, as software, as collective ritual, right? And we can output it to any of these areas if we had a really secure notion of how that refinement process operates.
Mhm.
With Jill's, I guess, arguments against models, I don't see it as an issue of models. I see it as an issue of the complexity of the models and how static they are, which is kind of where the human brain leads naturally by default, where when we generate these models, they have to be amenable to upgrade in some capacity. There has to be some mechanism where you reach a boundary condition, and if it's ill-defined, it's like, I think we talked about that before. It's like you've got this two OODA loops running, your primary OODA loop, that's your runtime OODA loop, that's just the default mode network engaging with the world, doing the observe, orient, decide, act. when it's going through the orient or decide part of that, if you're seeing a boundary condition that doesn't actually line up consistently, which is where the cognitive dissonance thing steps in, most people will just run away from that cognitive dissonance rather than engaging it and trying to upgrade those boundary conditions. So if you've got the runtime OODA loop running, and then you've got the secondary OODA loop that's tuning the system through the executive network, those pieces need to work together. And I think that's kind of the fundamental problem that we're dealing with, is a lot of that is decoupled. Much of that is because just the resource contention issue, where you can't be in cognitive or complete cognitive engagement all the time. You do need to pass stuff off to automated behavior. And then you've got that secondary push where the emotional stuff is just pulling people directly into the left brain. And then this whole other half, whether it be integrative or back and forth play between them, is basically shut off. So I think a big part for me is trying to figure out where to overcome those steps and processes, and where to kind of like breadcrumb people out of that, from just being kind of contained in the narrow focus space where they're not really seeing the whole picture, and kind of stepping back to look at broader context, especially when we come up across those boundary conditions where our internal models are being tested and they're not completely aligning with the world. It's like, there's the real learning opportunity. And that's where I think both Jill and I have talked about, like, kind of leaning into the difficulty of it rather than retreating away and saying, that's good enough. Well, it was good enough for the last time you came through. You're getting signal at this point that it's no longer good enough. It's time to actually have some attention to that and actually deal with the fact that we need an upgrade within this subcomponent of understanding.
Yeah, I would add a couple things to that. One is that two comments. One is that came up was the idea that within many psychotechnologies and practice traditions, like the problem is the problem, and if the problem is the problem, then you're almost like if you have a contentious, if you have a contentious relationship, I think there's a better word I'm looking for, not contentious, but anyway, if you have a bad relationship to your thinking mind, and you think that erupted thoughts, disruptive thoughts, uncomfortable thoughts are like kind of a sign of failure, then you might feel like an ironic sense of threat for having the thought. And now you're kind of in this kind of familiar dug in mode of like, where if it seems like if you're trying to practice something, you almost like are getting worse than if you just weren't practicing at all. Like this is
you're throw away all like deeper and deeper as
you go. Like that the part of you that's trying to fix the problem is the problem, and then but it's still a problem, and then so you bring in the part that's supposed to fix the problem, and that's the problem. So that's that kind of is pointing at like that. Why are we even talking about this need to do a move? And I think it's that the level of trappedness we find with these things is like it really is. I think this is a lot of pointing out why I kind of say it's like being in a dream. There are all these mechanisms in place that make it like dreamlike, that we forget we're in a dream. Just all these forces are kind of adding to our kind of madness of when we're trying to do this work and what gets us out. And I'd say within that place. I was going to say one more point. Okay. Yeah. I was going to say, okay, well, when you're in that place, the other part of, if you are familiar with a bunch of psychotechnologies, is you're probably going to be grasping wildly for like kind of rules-based or more like, procedural psychotechnologies to apply to it, which also are not the opening move, right? So you might actually be making things worse by studying it, having a giant library of techniques and, let me try this and try this and try this. Like, where, if you well, for instance, in the Inquire system, we keep it down to just a few very basic meditations, and that's it. Like, and they're all very simple because the move's very simple. But because people don't do the move, they kind of like speak to it different ways, and you get these exploding libraries of kind of approaches, which I think is another interesting problem of how do you present the move so simply that it doesn't become kind of co-opted as another procedural strategy that doesn't actually do the move, it just simulates doing the move. Thinks about doing the move.
So what I was going to point to earlier, there was like kind of the difference between contemplation and rumination. So if you're ruminating, you're just repeating this loop over and over again. Where in contemplation, you're trying to kind of open up a little bit and see broader context, not in the way that you're just kind of reaching and grasping at anything to try to fill the spot, but stepping back and really contemplating how these things fit together. I'm trying to find that balanced approach between, you're not just cycling the same thing over, ruminating and creating that kind of deeper habitual groove in a dysfunction. You're trying to look for branches and breaks out of that, where
Right.
the wall's a little lower, where it can maybe bump over, what kind of things are capable of interjecting into that process, so you can kind of step out of it a little bit. And it ties into another kind of cognitive model I had before. Where I looked at Nietzsche and Zen Buddhism in the same way. They have a similar operational approach to nihilism, where they treat it as a vector rather than a destination. So if you're in the space of this and you want to get away from this, it becomes like a nihilistic reaction to this, not this, where you really need to go past that and step into a third point of observation where you're creating or capable of creating some kind of a synthesis. And from that triangulation, you can start to break out more points of experience that look at different points of perspective and actually develop a full topology, which cycles back to the tacit knowledge pointers kind of thing, where a lot of people, their tacit knowledge pointers, like, here's Lego brick concept, where this should be actually pointing to a whole algorithm or a topology within that space to have a more robust understanding, which I think kind of parallels the cognitive chunking model, where you're going from a couple of buckets of being able to store a few pieces of or data points into schema-based thinking, where you're able to do a lot more with less, because you're starting to use design patterns around thinking, figuring out where algorithms will fit into different places, where they won't, and refining things as a system model rather than just a series of checkboxes where you're trying to do, Boolean matching.
Yeah, I think that those are all big and important points. I think what you're pointing out, and what I definitely keep trying to point out, is that there is something special and fundamental, and it has some shape, and we agree on everything you're pointing out, like these qualities that have that it has the ability to restore context, the stepping back move, the ability to look around, and the schema, and kind of what I not kind of and the resonance I have is having learned, feeling as though what satisfies those design constraints are the open and question forms that we see people using when they're helping each other with their attention system. That I made an argument in the store recently, kind of strongly, that as a kind of contentious point we could unpack, but that maybe to your point, all psychotechnology or all attention technologies like that are the effective part of the distilled point. If you look at any meditation form or anything, at some point the inquiry is what steers the attention. So you can almost say there's a identity between inquiry and attention. Like the words of inquiry are the psychotechnology of steering attention. So even if you're doing the most basic meditation of like, who am I, what's happening now, what's going on, like I challenge myself in my most fundamental meditation, like, is there inquiry here? And I realize there's kind of call it the Borat inquiry. Like there's a outtake in Borat where he's in the cheese aisle and he says, what is this? And they say, it's cheese. And what is this? It's cheese. And what is this? It's cheese. And it goes on and on. He just Borat does. And I was like, oh, that's kind of that it would be the vocalization of my meditation. What is this? This is, Jill sitting migraine. What is this? Jill sitting migraine, what is this? Like it's like this, not like what is this? What is this? What is this? What is this? Can you find a meditation form that an attentional form that doesn't have that openness to it, that brings you to, anything that does that move, right? So I'm kind of trying to, that's the challenge, is that I think that even though meditative inquiry is around in the meditation world, weirdly, to me, it gets a disproportionate, like not enough attention. That generally, even if people say self-inquiry, you're going with like, who am I? Which is like, that is only, as the Gurdjieff work would probably, point out very much so, like, there's the I, but there's also the am part of this, like that, there's that, there's just as much inquiry about what is this, that is not so much about me. And then of course, the understanding that anything that is like, who am I, has this like dubious quality and multiplicity, and may not even be introspectively available if you talk to wisdom people. So there's a lot to say about meditative inquiry that I feel like also isn't maybe spoken to enough in the psychotechnology world, but I don't want to, I obviously, my bias is dead obvious, right? A company called Inquire that I think it's important.
I think you're kind of pointing to a scope issue there in terms of the framing of the question, like too big or too narrow. Neither one of those is going to be effective at actually solving the kind of problem. With the open-ended questions, took me back to hiring process, like working at tons of different tech companies over the year, both going through hiring process, setting up hiring process, and doing interviews. I found the open-ended questions were the best. If I was hiring, like, I didn't care what you knew, I had to care how quickly you can learn. So I would give questions on a test that here's some basic problem solving. Whereas you go through a lot of HR hiring process, it's like, oh, do you know all these references from the manual from this specific iteration or whatever? And that's great for people who've just kind of, memorized the book, but don't really have an embodied knowledge of how it works. Whereas if you're able to actually effectively problem solve, you can take those small components and generate a solution. Maybe it's not complete, maybe it's not completely effective, but at least you're able to go through that process of taking the pieces on the table and trying to figure out some kind of strategy of approaching it. And when you've got that pattern for the strategy, then you can kind of break it down and look at smaller pieces of where it can be refined to get closer and closer towards an optimal solution.
Yeah, I think that the open-ended questions in a social capacity where we ask them others, I think it is interesting that we are basically saying, paint me a picture, like you fill in for me. Where the close-ended, you're getting so little information. But yeah, the open-ended are quite good like that. And I just have one little comment, and then I'll like to hear, give it back to Layman. But that the I forget the name of it. It might just be called it. I should remember what this is called. But there's a known process in HR, which is basically their bullshit detection, which is a technique where they just ask people open-ended questions, much like if you're on trial, right? And you're just relying on your own ability to say that doesn't add up. And so that gets kind of back to what you were saying, Jason, earlier about that there is something else that we're pointing out here, which is to say that there is like I think you called it a schema, that there's some kind of schema or, like a repeating, there's a patterning or like that we can do that for anybody. Implies that there's some schema of reason having to do with detecting people don't add up, finding the dissonance, that there's some universals there. We don't say, well, I wouldn't be able to tell if you don't add up because I've never been an engineer. I can just, as an HR person, say, tell me about your experience of engineer. And you're like, well, I worked at so-and-so. Huh? What was it like there? I worked with this person. What were they like? Okay. Yeah. We found the edge of you being able to tap into tacit knowledge. You just bullshitted me on that point. So what else, or whatever, like we somehow can simulate another person painting pictures for us and then see where the picture breaks down. I think is really,
you can see where those pointers are kind of vague that you can ask someone to kind of drill down and fill out, and that's where you'll see
or you're just seeing
where their boundary conditions are failing or where they're able to grasp what's going on.
Yeah, like if you keep asking long enough, eventually there'll be the inconsistencies will become apparent, and that kind of speaks also like the memory palace that we're situating things when we simulate another person in such a way that we really can kind of have this infinite capacity for once things are situated to paint a picture. And be like, well, that picture doesn't add up if we're actively, listening. That we just have that baked in as like a capacity that is really valuable. And kind of the last thing about that, to me that I've kind of written about how that, is why we have juries and trials and talk about being able to, what are we doing when we're saying trying to evaluate whether someone's guilty or innocent, or in the right mind, like especially the insanity plea, minus what a psychiatrist would say. And I think to generally listen to someone's story on trial and get a sense of who they are and then hear about the act they did, to say there's no way you're in your right mind when you did that because no one in their right mind would make that choice.
Or it's completely incongruent with your normal behavior or.
The same idea, right? Is that like you'd be sabotaging so much stuff. This obviously doesn't add up with your life. How could you be someone who does this and then does this? And we kind of like try to say, does that not add up? Well, then the explanation is that you were in some sense not in your right mind at the time. It was like kind of passion or something. Versus, saying, I added it all up and you're going to get the will if you off grandma, like that totally adds up. This is premeditated. So, the implicit algorithm we have for adding up, not adding up, is what I kind of point at, is like this untapped potential that's super powerful that we're not going to offload to computers, and we better not, but we're trying to, and we better not. And I think that might be something else we kind of resonate on. And I think with a lot of IDW people, maybe I hear undercurrents of like, somehow we're not valuing our capacity for common sense. And then, like how do we speak to that in a way that's doesn't sound provincial or Neanderthal, or, like, how do we elevate that capacity we have to bullshit detect without kind of bringing in the fact that everybody, what we don't want, just saying everybody's an expert on this thing, even though I just read a couple articles, versus spending 30 years of my life studying it,
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were saying that, Jill, about a report I'd seen a few years ago for some nations' transportation security, making a shift from previously having used body posture and micro gestures and things like that as an indicator of whether people are deceiving you, and then compiling a whole bunch of data saying basically that doesn't work, or it certainly doesn't work with the people we're hiring to do airport security. And the much more effective strategy is just to ask people very open-ended questions and get a sense of what they're saying, because we have this built-in analytic system for that. I think you can make a pretty plausible argument that it's at least an analogy, or perhaps a higher level replication of the basic pattern that's in all attentional practice, right? Even if it's at different levels, right? You can emotionally or sensorily lean into something in a way that basically would have to be described as an open-ended question if we were running it through the higher cognitive architecture. Mm-hmm. And if we're trying to think of these things as information technologies, then they're information transfer technologies. Mm-hmm. And in order to initiate the transfer, you have to put the question mark on something in order to begin that process.
Query.
Otherwise, it's not because you can do almost any psychotechnology could be phrased in a way that's open or closed, right? Like I could be concentrating on a statue of Shiva in a way where I'm just like, that's the statue of Shiva. Or I could be concentrating on a statue of Shiva where I'm, well, what the hell is this thing? Right. Mm-hmm. Very same description of practice with that slight tweak where the information actually begins to flow and become part of the process that we're undergoing that might have some self-refining capacity to it.
Let's pause on that for a second. I think this is a really good one, if you don't mind, or come back to the statue of Shiva concentration exercises within meditative inquiry.
No, wherever you want to go with this.
Well, do you want to finish your?
No, I'm ready to jump off.
Okay. Sorry if I seem at all like, if there's anything that sounds irritated in my tone or my facial expressions, I woke up with kind of a pre-migraine state, so I'm dealing with body stress, and has nothing to do with you two.
We'll just assume it's your natural temperament.
Yeah, well, right. I'm not that level of the matrix yet. Damn it. Might be true. He's sharing more than I intended to. So I'm doing a focused attention exercise. It's just the statue of Shiva idea. It's interesting to me to ask the question of like a psychotechnology deployed kind of obediently or from a rules thing that has that kind of attentional effect, like the close-ended psychotechnology, like just do the practice, it works kind of thing. I think that's interesting to contrast. With, do you get benefit? What I'm curious about is, do you actually get benefit, or, there is a little bit of like, one might say like kind of this strong arming, sure, you're definitely changing where the blood's flowing in the brain and where the, letting things recharge and letting things rest. And, it's definitely like strong arming. Like I kind of see it as like enforced rest, that's definitely doing something, and it might be necessary preconditions, but I think it's still interesting to think about, is there a close-ended form that would get at this problem we're discussing of like reprogramming? Can it fundamentally get at the piano player, or are you just reprogramming yourself?
I kind of see this like a techne arte distinction, where there's a base level of technical skill you need to learn. So with the piano thing, like you're learning the scales, but if you only ever play the scales, are you really a musician? Because you've never actually like played a tune, created a tune. So there needs to be a baseline training of the system where you've got the technical skill to do that. And then from that technical skill, you need to kind of take that out into the next level, to use that horrible phrase.
Right. And so like,
yeah, but there has to be the baseline competence, and you have to bring in the art part of that in order to generate and create something else.
Right. And so it's, if we take that scales analogy, if you were trying to learn about the piano, there's exercises you could do where it's like, just play the note, just play the note. And then there would be, I guess I'm arguing perhaps analogies that if you were to just learn scales with only that process, you would then just learn scales. See, I'd have Mary had a little lamb and scales in my head, and that's all I'd have. But for me to do the mapping of the scales onto, did you see what happened? You are a piano and you're playing yourself, and this is what's going on. You might still need the additional open-ended process on top of that, where you've just set up a scenario, but the actual inquiry is like, what's happening right now? What's happening in the piano? What's happening in the world? What's happening after? What happened before? What's different? Things like, for instance, be some things you could ask yourself to start to, what would happen if you did this and this, played these two things together? Like, so that's the question, I guess.
Yeah, I think it seems to me that intentionality and curiosity have to operate together in order to make that difference, right? Like if you only had curiosity, that curiosity could be part of your just rumination loop, just a person who endlessly asks the same questions over and over again without applying any kind of practice, without doing it as a contemplation or as an effort or as an engagement. On the other hand, if you just have intentionality, or if someone guides your intentionality in a way where you're not actually curious about what it is that you're involved in, then maybe you re-script yourself, but you don't necessarily get a richer layer of being. So I think you have to have both of those. And if you have both of those, it's potential that anything could be practiced, right? It's not necessarily ideal, but if a person was just playing the scales and then they really got into that could become their form of music. So like almost any pattern experience could be a form of actual practice if it had those two elements working together. But if you only have one, or if you have neither, then it's going to be totally closed.
I think, I think I want to challenge, I think it'd be fun to challenge if it's curiosity and intention, or just curiosity, because I'm wondering if that's the right, I'm wondering what curiosity researchers would say, like to me, about whether or not curiosity is engaged in a ruminative loop. Is there any element of curiosity happening in a default mode? Do we actually have the experience of curiosity? Because to me, I would say that that's a curiosity absent condition. And so there might be like that might be a confound there, that the putting together intention with curiosity, to me, is that intention can evoke curiosity. Like the intentional machinery can reveal things that ignite curiosity. So like they set it as a background process. So like if I intend to lucid dream, I invoke the idea of lucid dreaming. I set the intention to lucid dream, but ultimately the machinery of waking up in a dream means I need to bring curiosity to the dream state. Somehow I need to find a place to, what is this? It's just for a second in the dream. Is this a dream? Somehow that has to somehow emerge. And what does it emerge from if it's not already there? So I think that's a really interesting thing of the interplay between how do you set intention to evoke curiosity as a background, as a kind of a process. How do those two work together?
Yeah, the image I just got in my mind was of it's been used in a lot of areas, like a pen writing on a piece of paper, right? It's got the form, but then also you have to actually press it onto the piece of paper to make those movements come. So the way I would think about it initially, and I don't know, it could go either way, right? Whether they can be separated or not separated, or you need one or the other, but it might be that the form of curiosity requires like a +1. It has to go, you have to go, actually, yes, I'm curious, right? There's a an intention-like affirmative quality to the curiosity, which might distinguish it from some other less productive forms of curiosity. What were you going to say, Jason?
So with curiosity, you're engaging the approach network. So that is different from the default network. That's active engagement, but your baseline of curiosity is going to be highly correlated with the dimension of openness. So if someone doesn't have much of that in the first place, there's not a whole lot you can do to engender that unless you can somehow figure out how to speak to the inner 5-year-old and get some kind of a spark going there. But engaging curiosity is going to take you out of the default mode network into the approach network, where you're actually searching and engaging the environment. I think the approach network is kind of this optimal exploration space where you're cognitively engaged and you're physically or sensorially actively engaged with what's going on either in the environment or whatever problem domain that you're looking at. So there's an intent to engage and explore and to push and figure out where those boundaries are, rather than just sit back and coast thing.
Yeah, that's a nice compliment. I would maybe take issue with the idea. I do take issue in general with the personality types being global and not contextualized. I do think that our model of it basically is to put forth the idea that the dissonance is like whether you like it or not, the dissonance creates the curiosity as long as it's not threatening. So, you recognize a dissonance in your environment. Oh my God, is it a snake? Is it a stick? I don't know for now. I'm going to just it's not what I expected. I'm going to jump back and I'm going to I can't resist at some point verifying when I feel safe, was it a snake or was it a stick? I got to go check it out. And then there's an arc to that. Unless I just absolutely am not interested in snakes and sticks because this walk is about this other thing. My life's totally together. It's always worked for me. I was born a winner. I stay a winner. I don't need to change anything. Who cares about the stakes and sticks, which might be your openness to experience, until it matters. So that's maybe also the Gurdjieff Buddhist idea of circumstances could force your hand on that and force you to start to be vulnerable and open and feel that vulnerability to life that makes you have to be open to it and investigate. I have to make sense of it. So I think that we see. So some part of the reason I think that, and this is another thing I want to I feel like needs more airplay in the world, is this idea that people are resistant to dissonance. And in our experiments and what we would challenge, anyone listening to maybe examine in their own lives, see if it's true for them. And beyond our experience, there's a principle there. And in our experience, this principle has tremendous explanatory power that, it's the problem of the backfire effect testing, that basically when we only observe other people and ourselves being resistant to dissonant information presented by other people while we're in a social context where it's very awkward to update our thinking. So we kind of dig in. But then when you're presented with dissonant information on your own, when you are not constrained, threat, or whatever otherwise, with the social engagement, that you can observe that there is actually not there. It is very much like a stick internally. There's a cycle of if you're afraid of it, you're afraid of it. But if you're not, and if you're afraid of it, you can identify that why. It's not like an arbitrary, I don't like dissonance. It's that sometimes you are, and sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes you're immediately drawn by the dissonance and fascinated by it. And it can be really delightful. And the dissonance is just oh my God, the insight to dissonance insight to curiosity, dissonance cycle can be almost instant, where you just move right in and you see the insight process got precipitated by the dissonance, and there's no fear there because the things you're dealing with aren't scary. They're just dissonant. So I think the aversion, attached to the object, attached to the threat model that might be a part of, pulling that piece out, seeing the more that there isn't so when you're talking about Layman, bringing in intentionality to overcome any barrier into the curiosity, I kind of see that as having to overcome whatever's getting in the way of your natural curiosity, which they could be many things, and bringing that intentionality to practice. For me, bringing the intentionality practice, this came up recently. I was aware of the fact that my desire to do anything intentional with practice, I kind of have to be persuaded at this age that I'll do it once out of curiosity on what's going to happen, but to keep doing it, like I really have to be persuaded that something good's going to come of it over doing something else. And so there's a lot of machinery I might bring in to overcome different resistances, like, well, just do it anyway because you're part of a group, or just do it anyway because you won't know for another year, even though you don't really feel like anything's coming of it. Your intuition says one thing, but you could be wrong. And I'm doing all these like overrides to try to push through and bring intentionality to practice, where once I know I pushed over it, there might be like this much curiosity, but actually I have this much curiosity to go think about something else in my life, but I'm not going there because I'm here to practice. So I think there's also that, where does my mind naturally want to go, or does it want to just go to the rumination? And overcoming that
really
barrier, which is a whole other thing.
Right? Like the curiosity around what would it look like if I kept doing this for a year?
Right.
That's an interesting one, because you don't hold it in the same way as you hold curiosity in terms of what am I most fascinated by in this moment. So
right.
A number of different styles of curiosity would be suggested.
Right. And in that way, you kind of have to like outsource that curiosity and then have that override, act as intentionality on what you're examining right now. And so an inquiry, I think I mentioned this before, we don't mess around with we're a much simpler model. We're testing the idea of you're safe to just follow whatever's bothering you, and whatever's bothering you is a really good guide towards, like, there's lots of material there. Like you can just keep going with that one in a self-guided way and not have any just competitive stuff. It can be completely just working with what arises with the framework, which we'll get back to, but there's so much, the frameworks in the machinery of how to work with what arises versus the extrinsic maybe machinery of like, this is a really interesting thing to work on, and now this is a really interesting thing to work on, because everybody generally culturally finds this thing interesting and then this thing interesting. It's kind of the opposite. It's purely intrinsic of like, you will, if you're being bothered, there's, that's the signal, or if you're distracted, that's the signal.
I like the notion of chasing those kind of signals. Those are the places where you're running into boundary conditions that haven't worked for you to date. So as I see it, you spend this time tuning the default mode network, and you can let it run until you run into such a condition. At that point, if you don't have time to do it in the moment, you should mark it to come back to later, but take the opportunity to do whatever upgrades need to happen here as far as you can go within that specific context. But that's like the real opening of the learning opportunity, is like, okay, notice that, take a little bit of working space and try to refine either your approach, your model, or your comprehension of what it is, step back from it. Maybe at this point, after a couple dozen iterations, you have enough information to figure out where the kind of next bridge in that space is and how to transition into that. But yeah, when those internal tensions come up, or you're seeing that incongruency, or you're hitting that boundary condition where the model is not actually, your internalized model is not actually congruent with what's happening in your experience or within the world, that's the opportunity to dig in and try to figure it out rather than running away. Because especially the salience of the problem is going to be very high because you're actually engaged in it, where if you put it to the back of your mind and come back 6 weeks later, you may not have the same perspective on it or the same intensity of experience, and you may have lost some of the opportunity of how much upgrade you can do at that one specific instance.
Right. I'm curious about, sorry, Layman, looks like you want to go in a certain direction, but I'll just, at some point, I'm curious about this idea of models and models as psychotechnology itself and what that does to restore. But
yeah, I was curious because we're, on the one hand, you take the archetype of that process that Jason just described there, right? And you go, well, we could instantiate that through software so that people in a safe place could go through these processes on their own. But I'm curious from you, Jason, how you think about that getting encoded as symbol, as ritual, as dramaturgy. Like, the mystery schools are putting forth both psychotechnologies that individuals can use, but also they have a certain demonstrative pageantry to them so that they can collectively gather in front of these patterns and have a look at them. So, what do you think is a good version of that? Have you seen good versions of that? Do you have a sense of how you would like to design a version of that? How do you set that up as social ritual?
One of the places I started looking at this was in terms of updating Masonic ritual. So I think there's a number of issues with that. It's outside of co-masonry, it's all male-based, like it's entirely male ritual. The other aspect of that is you're not supposed to innovate anything within Masonic ritual. What I would kind of the high-level approach was to take some of the structures of Freemasonry, where the liturgy is based off of the Old Testament, but to bring that and base some of the liturgy off of like software development. So the whole learn how to code phrase that came out a couple of years ago, I think has some really deep value in it, because if you learn how to program, you start to think in purely logical patterns and you see whether or not your logic actually stands up to test. And deep iterations of that process, I think you start to be able to construct more efficient, more effective and more higher quality models with less effort over time. Like it's basically a practice thing where you learn the base levels of the domain, you start to solve some simpler problems. And as you go on, you can start to solve more and more complex problems. But I think there are some really significant parallels to explore between software technology, psychotechnologies, and kind of life itself. Like I was going through Robert Sapolsky's human evolutionary biology thing, and the molecular biology portion of that, I think there's like 3 lectures. He's going through and talking about DNA, and I'm like, there's so much high-level software stuff like fucking baked right into DNA. We haven't invented anything. Some of these really core architectural principles are right there at the most fundamental layer of being, like the way it's able to manage change management, the way you can take a gene, it's fixed to whatever proteins it will transcribe, but you can spool up multiple or less instances of each of those protein generators within that cell as it's re-spooled up. The way change management is handled, the way the code base is managed, where you can have parts of a gene kind of expressed across different parts of the genome, and at runtime, it's reassembling and pulling all these things in together in a coherent piece. So you can basically tack on to the end of the structure instead of having, in terms of a read-write, going into like the beginning, we'll insert the extra pieces here so everything's kind of contiguous within the analog memory. But it's able to distribute these things kind of across the genome and then do a reassembly at runtime. Like some of the stuff that was happening at the genetic level in terms of software principles, it just kind of blew my mind. I was like, holy shit, we really have not invented anything. When we find knowledge, we're recognizing and extracting that out of the world, not kind of inventing things from whole cloth.
Let me see if this is a really exciting point to me. If I understand what you're saying, tell me if this resonates. I'm coming at it from a different direction, which is I actually did some graduate work in biophysics in the 90s, and I gave up because no one was studying biophysics the way I wanted to do it. But I think they're getting closer now. But in hearing all the stories of how all the complexity going on in the machinery of the cell, as you described, like this is such a complex process, and simultaneously learning about the biophysics of biomolecules, they're fascinating. Like every biomolecule we have has like a two-way switch where, it can change with it's tuned to very small temperature changes. Take that how you want, because we're not dealing with thermodynamics really in the cell, but so you might imagine a little bit if you want to really go there. But with very small temperature changes, it cold denatures, warm denatures, and with the denaturing, it also changes from insulator to semiconductor. And so you have like the free electrons, and of course you have conformational changes. So you have like all these different qualities, and the conformational changes the self-assembly. Now add into that the fact that the nature of the interactions of biomolecules is mainly hydrophobic, hydrophilic, and electrostatic forces similar to water are driving the conformational changes in all of this. And then the energetics of that is on par with the energetics of structuring water. So if you actually want to do energetic calculations of biomolecules, you need to include the water around the biomolecule as part of the structure. Now, coupled with that, what we know from soft condensed matter physics water studies, that water will feel forces and interact up to 12 layers deep it will form. It's not, water is just not all sloshy. It's got so much going on that if you structure it on a surface, you can see up to 12 layers deep, the structure is penetrated through. And now electrostatics, you have all kinds of things going on that basically they combine to form longer range forces. So if they form sheets, you get a 1/r instead of 1/r squared. So you're starting to get all these really interesting scaling arguments. You're getting all these really interesting excluded volume arguments, which are global constraints. And underneath all that, every machinery you pointed at requires a movement of molecules around in the soup that are feeling all that electric potential of every other molecule participating. And so that is like a purely, completely polyadic mess. Like it is insane. Like you take the complexity you have of the machinery of the cell that you could actually describe the way we think of machines. And then you start adding what's really going on in the biophysics. The explosion is absolutely intractable that we have evolved to animate. Like right now, me just doing that gesture is insane of what just happened from the quantum mechanics of the microtubules from my brain down to my fingertips happening almost simultaneously, like something going on at every level. It's absolutely mind blowing that we're animate and how the animation works. So I feel like, to your point, I have this argument. I haven't had I feel like this is the talk of things that have been hard for me to articulate that I'm really, that's what it turned into me for anyways, like bringing forth some things that have been really hard to articulate that maybe resonate around, which is that if we don't start to understand like how this cognitive system, how powerful this is in terms of its ability to maybe do analog computing, that it can choose how to move those things around, like obviously to simulate this, like we should be so humbled by that. And that humility is just missing so much from our approach towards AI, psychotechnologies, and there's sort of this and even like our capacity for doing incredible things with our minds. I think that if we appreciate how incredible what biological systems are already doing and the mapping between our cognitive systems and what they do intrinsically, if we could start to see that, I think we might have a little more hope in our ability to tackle wicked problems, because we've really been fighting with one arm tied behind our back, that we've decided to force ourselves into the mechanical, the structured, the analytic, the logical, instead of learning how to form the right boundary conditions to contain the imaginal, intuitive, simulated based, machinery we have. Then shouldn't even call it machinery, whatever we want to call it.
I think that pairing between linear systems and dynamic systems as well, like making the shift. Linear is okay for the habituated stuff, but it really has to be a dynamic ecosystem or full integrated system in order to get to that other space. And
all the emergent stuff you have around that, and not least of which is global constraints, which I think are completely unappreciated with physics. And they're so hairy. I don't think people understand how to think about them. Like, so basically, like the excluded volume constraint would say, hey, all you molecules, take up as much space as you can simultaneously, because there's a lot of space, and how does that change the whole system? And if I take up more space, you don't have to take up as much space. So there's this idea of like these emergent collective qualities that can happen through phase transitions, everything else that just happen in fluid complex systems all the time, that we can be leveraging to do global optimization. And global optimization is a really big deal, because I'm sure Jason is like, if you're trying to solve any kind of problem that's complex, like our complex wicked problems grow exponentially. You add more and more components and there's more and more combinations. And so if you say, well, how do I get to a global optimum without searching every possible combination and measuring it out? Well, the argument is that living systems can do through analog computing a kind of global optimization by setting the boundary conditions that say, just optimize. Here's your configuration, sync, relax, do what energetic systems do, relax into your lowest energy state. What will emerge is the solution. That we can do that move is not a rational analytic, it's a global constraint based, but it's also not woo. I think that's like kind of like we can talk about quite specifically, and we see that in the slime mold, right? The early ideas about, we don't know yet how they seem to do global optimization. You put them in a constraint-based system and they seem to be able to solve the traveling salesman problem faster than algorithmic. We'd expect algorithmically, because that's what they're designed to do. So I think that's also, that's also some inspiration I have. Like, we don't really know the biophysics of living systems yet to even know what their upper bound on their capacity is. And that should be like a source of hope.
Jill, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned a curiosity around models. And I want to know if you want to probe into that a little bit more with the time we have left.
Well, I'd like to bring it back to Jason's point, which I feel like that you want to bring Jason back to, which is the ritual spaces. And that's what I was kind of getting at, as we talked about all these ways you can step back and look around. So a couple things is that I want to point out, which is that, Gurdjieff and others, and the default mode network and everything we're talking about left hemisphere. I'm going to say default mode network by proxy, because I'm worried that abstraction may not hold up, may not age well. I'm not sure.
Fair enough.
I've been warned by my co-founder to stay away from brain generalizations because they generally kind of crash and burn all the time. But we're using it as a proxy for this. And we're using left hemisphere as well, but that one seems a little bit more understood as vague. So the idea is that you have these normal associations and you're trying to break it up and bring in new associations and look around, and that we're obviously trying to overcome the associative nature of the mind, and we're trying to bring in different players or piano players and this kind of idea. And you can do it kind of two ways. Open-ended question says, just start looking around, and just try to open up the query, like start the suction going, like anything there, is there anyone out there? Like, can I hold my attention there and eventually make a connection to something I don't have in this context even? Or can I prime myself, with something that isn't normally associated, because I have created a model and I can go to that model. And this is, I think, the huge leverage of software, of articulating things into languaging, put them into static systems that we can use as psychotechnologies, breadcrumbs to anchor in and bring in. And I think we can do the same thing with environments, right? So like they all can be things that, like, you take your problems and you put it into an environment, and the environment or the person, or, a person can be a psychotechnology, a charismatic person, a crush, can all of a sudden like be really strong intrusion of context to contextualize what we're dealing with. So I think that that whole idea of choosing our environment, leveraging ritual, leveraging animal magnetism, charisma, others' desire, leveraging everything we can, to take our closed loop and kind of, there's lots of ways we can impose things on it by attuning to have an environment that we habitually attune to, or whatever, or so strong that we can't help but attune to, or having someone we tell, get as big as you need to be to get me to attune to you. Like, I'm going to choose you as a person, as a guru, as a leader, as a teacher, to ask you to be as big as you need to be so that you force your context into my loop, which is another move we do. Yeah. So I think that's that part of being out in the world is interesting to me. And the other last thing that, I don't know where we're going, I just wanted to throw out one last thing we haven't really touched on that I earmarked from Jason's speaking was a lot of the talk about, these collective processes of attuning to each other, or what I point out as collective, I think I'm pointing out as collective natural intelligence. And maybe what you're pointing out, Jason, is like, how can you bring, different processes to get at this, what practices can we do together to get specifically at this, like, trapped, attention system, default mode, what everything we're pointing out today, like, is there a distillation of how we do that with each other? And does something different emerge if we do it together?
If we do it together, if nothing else, you get a sense of shared experience, which is kind of a baseline for building any sense of community. So I think that aspect of it is important. In the ritual pieces that I've looked at, I've looked less at collective ritual stuff and more so at micro skill things. So the Shadowgate stuff that I put together, it's like a 3-part musical journey that's, I assume, fairly intense, because I still haven't found anybody who's been able to listen through it. But that one is specifically about trying to deal with neuroticism and ego death and the acceptance of that kind of whole journey, to take it down from, like, okay, here's a heroic dose of mushrooms, here's an analog process that's just through musical experience, and trying to figure out gradient points along those kind of journeys so that we can start something that's more simple and accessible and be able to ramp up that chain kind of as you go along. And depending on who people are, what their biases are, what their background is, that you can just kind of hook into that process, go through those exercises, maybe continue up that. Maybe you don't need to do the whole chain, but those I see as entryways to the more central conversation. That this circles back to the outer school problems. Like I think you mentioned something in that conversation with Layman about if Wilbur had read Gurdjieff, then he probably wouldn't have done all the other stuff. And I see parallels with that in a lot of different things where there's missing background. So we're doing exactly what we shouldn't do in software, which is reinvent the wheel all the time, as opposed to looking to see where best practices and known design patterns are and trying to build on top of those, because at least those, we have a sense of constraint. We can see where those models have limitations or failures, and we can try to address those directly to see whether that model or submodel is capable of being upgraded or whether it's just a dead end and it's only limited context. And to try to lay out the topology of those things kind of as we go along. So I think part of that is the bridging process, because in order to get people even towards the conversations that we want to have, there's a boatload of work that needs to be done for most of the population to get anywhere fucking close to that space. From what I see, like I try to be gentle to a degree when engaging people, although sometimes I'm definitely not. But the limitations and understanding, like where with the task knowledge pointers, where you're pointing to something where maybe it's cross-domain knowledge, maybe you're mixing 2 or 3 different or 4 different domains into kind of a coherent model and trying to show how these different pieces are all kind of interleaved and overlapping in terms of what they're expressing. But if someone doesn't have the reference point to do that, it's just like, oh, woo, or you don't know what you're talking about. And I feel like I hit that fucking brick wall almost constantly in dealing with people. It's like I'm trying to use the simplest terms possible. I'm trying to be domain specific and domain recognized terms. And it's just like, just trying to convey that to people, I think for me is a massive difficulty. I'm trying to figure out where to bridge those 2 points and how to lay out kind of the breadcrumb along that trail, so that you can lead someone along to, it's like, okay, here's the perspective. Now I got it. We can go through these different stages of understanding how these components fit together and align into kind of a coherent topology. I find bringing people along that kind of an arc exceptionally difficult. I mean, I think much of that is my own challenges in terms of temperament and language and being a weird aspy redneck, and some of that is just baseline within the population. So I've gone through enough of those iterations. I know it's not entirely me. I see consistent patterns in terms of how people approach and deal with those kinds of things. And that I think much of that comes back to the cognitive dissonance thing, where if you're stuck in the system one model and you challenge the model, it's a challenge to self and identity and existence. And then people are just like, whoop, nope, done with that.
I really like the design pattern, anti-pattern map. Like I've wanted to articulate something similar, that I've wanted some sort of effort to come at this whole spiritual endeavor with a little bit of can we step back on all this and kind of assess like what's been happening and what are the different modes, models, things going on. Like I am really interested to unpack cult dynamics. I think that can be done more carefully. A lot of things like we've done on this call. I think this has been successful. For me, it's been a successful example of teasing apart some really cool core pieces, and playing with them. But I feel like we walked away with them more resolved in our mind, and that this process could continue into an examination, maybe of the last 100 years of the psychotechnology endeavors in Western or whatever, however big a scope we want. But we have so much to pull on to say, here's the meta patterns, like you said, like can we start to get systematic about this? Like here's this system, using that as the using that experiential network of practitioners and schools and attempts and say, yeah, like I think you pointed this earlier and we didn't really unpack it, but so much blue sky stuff going on. And I think that for both of us, having seen so much, you just think blue sky is not the way forward here. We did lots of blue sky the last 100 years. It's time for us to gather all those blue sky experiments together and do better. Say, where did they fail? Post-mortem, like, is there patterns here? Can we document? Can we find a shared language around it? Can we point at it? Can we do the metacognitive training of like, here's how to consume spiritual technologies, spiritual paths? Like, can we give people, tool them up better, religious / spiritual? Here's how to, you don't need to throw it out. You shouldn't throw it out. So without dishonoring, that very gentle thing, you don't throw out all software to talk about patterns and anti-patterns. You just say, well, let's bear this in mind and now create whatever thing we want to adapt to whatever we feel like doing together.
Some of that is pulling back and looking at the analytical structures, and some of that is addressing the problem of people's reluctance to move out of that blue sky mode emotionally or physiologically. Like, there was an interesting correspondence I heard in what you guys were saying, where Jason is talking about people need a lot more background and skill that they have, but also there's an unwillingness to undergo the death of certain identity parameters that are associated with their current way of looking at it. And the role of death is built into a lot of these ceremony and symbolic processes. Mm. And death also sounds very similar to, Jill, when you were talking about relaxing into your lowest energy state in order to participate in a process that nature has built in that can solve some of the conundrums of combinatorial explosion that we can't figure out in a linear sequence. So there's something about dropping down into that state, about accepting death, about leaning into dissonance, which people are very uncomfortable with, but there's an emotional skill there that seems to be necessary in order to move forward with any of this, that has to be coupled to an analytic overview of what's worked and what hasn't worked, and how we get the patterns and the anti-patterns together in a simplified enough way to start to deploy it in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, and so that, I heard you talk, Jason, earlier about call, which I was not aware of. I don't really follow Peterson, Harris, and the third, I forgot who, maybe it was Weinstein, but I think it was the third triad for this one, talking about a call for a psychedelic mystery school combo explosion renaissance or something. I don't think you could have anything. I don't think you can pull it off without good design parameters and constraints. Yeah. And like, yeah, so that's what I think. I know we're probably going to wrap up here, but that was kind of what I was kind of touching on, maybe eventually arriving at, is kind of if we set enough groundwork to kind of examine where do we think the world is today, and would it be more conducive to a religious model or a mystery school model or something else, like, without having to restrict ourselves to those two options. And I
think to a degree we need both, because there's always going to be a segment of the population that is always going to need to be treated like children, and that they need to have a functional model. But that model can't be the one that's actually driving the process. It has to be the shamanic or mystic or mystery tradition model that's actually driving this and bringing it along, dragging it along, kicking and screaming behind it. But between the two of them, they have to be coherent. So the representation has to be a raster representation, not a vector representation, not raster. So if you do have the set of rules versus set of tools, the set of rules need to be coherent and consistent with the set of tools, and also try to provide some kind of a bridging across that process, and not just be, this is the be all and end all. No, here's the entry stage. If you want to stay here, that's fine. These rule sets are coherent, but if you do want to progress across that, and there is some kind of a clear path or paths of exploration to get between those two states.
I agree. And I think as part of all that, this is part of what I've been excited about with the Inquire project, is that you can do things with technology that would protect. A lot of what we're talking about is that these things start out pure. This is a lot of what we were pointing out in our talk, Layman, where I was suggesting if people read Gurdjieff, if they can get through tales, they'll see endless stories of like kind of the arc of corruption of great beginnings and all the various ways that these things kind of get ruined and turn from maybe where they started out with it, maybe that kind of coupling or that intention, but then how do the power structures take over the religion, how they shut down the inquiry, and quite intentionally, right? Because that's disabuse, that you have to do that to, basically how do you protect these systems, I think is also something that we could talk about, patterns, anti-patterns, and then the construction and deployment that would be necessary for their success.
Yeah, because you need something, within the default loop that people are living through. There has to be something programmed into that loop that suggests they move out of it, or suggests at least that they cooperate with the inputs coming from people who are better at doing that meta loop outside of that. That seems absolutely essential, certainly for a large segment of the population, but at the same time, that's extremely easily hackable by any number of other incentive structures. So engendering that and protecting it are two important tasks here. But I guess we're at the end of this. We'll see how it sits with us, whether we want it broadcast or not. But I think it's a great beginning. I think we're a lot more on the same page and a lot more resonant, and have brought forward a lot of several pieces, at least, of what we intuitively felt we might have in common.
Yeah,
I think it was a really good discussion. I'd like to see us put it out to public and get some more feedback on it, and maybe we can bring some more people into the circle.
Yeah, I like the I like this. What we're getting at is design patterns, anti-patterns, and I think it was the clearest note. But everything else that followed, this idea that there should be a way to start to distill out things that'd be helpful towards doing better than blue skies again and again and again.
Better than blue skies. All right, nice seeing both of you.
Better than blue skies.